Chuck Adams didn't just walk onto the America's Got Talent stage. He emerged from a decade of silence, a long-forgotten voice whose return left even the most jaded viewers in awe. It wasn't just the raw power of his stripped-down cover, of Goo Goo Dolls' Iris that shook the auditorium to its core. It was the weight of his journey, years of pain woven into every word he sang. From the moment he opened his mouth, the audience leaned in, not just to hear a familiar tune, but to feel the soul of a man who had clawed his way back from the edge. For many, Chuck's audition reignited their faith in AGT itself. A show that had become formulaic was suddenly made meaningful again by one man and his guitar. But the crowd didn't know what had come before. They didn't know this wasn't his first dance with fame. Behind the applause was a history of highs that should have made him a household name and lows so devastating they nearly broke him for good. What started as a standing ovation quickly turned into an internet wave, with viewers from all corners rallying around the man they now saw as a symbol of redemption. Yet what made his performance truly special wasn't the polish. It was the imperfection, the nerves, the cracks in his voice. These weren't flaws. They were battle scars from a music industry that chewed him up and spit him out. And unlike the countless hopefuls who dream of stardom, Chuck had already tasted it. He had ridden the machine. He had been packaged, promoted, and ultimately discarded. So when he returned, it wasn't for a second shot at fame. It was a quiet act of defiance, a declaration that soul doesn't expire and talent doesn't vanish. In that brief televised moment, Chuck Adams didn't just audition. He reminded America what music is supposed to do. Not impress, not perform, but connect. And the connection he created was so strong, so deeply felt, that thousands began digging into his past, asking the question that this video is here to answer. Who exactly is Chuck Adams? And what happened to him before that viral performance that shook the nation? Long before Chuck Adams became a viral sensation on America's Got Talent, before he was a songwriter rubbing shoulders with the likes of Rick Ross and Stargate, he was just a quiet boy in Connecticut with a voice too big for the living room that contained it. Born into a modest family, Chuck's first exposure to music wasn't in a studio or on a stage, but in his own home, where at just 8 years old he was already belting out Elvis Presley covers to anyone who would listen. He wasn't trying to be famous, he was trying to feel. Encouraged by his mother Betty, who would become the emotional center of his life, Chuck treated music not as a performance but as therapy. It wasn't long before music became less of a pastime and more of a compass, an internal guide through adolescence, pressure, and self-discovery. Unlike so many polished child prodigies today, Chuck wasn't molded by the industry. He wasn't enrolled in elite programs or taught by celebrity coaches. He learned by listening, by feeling, by experimenting, with a secondhand guitar and a mind full of melodies. And what he lacked in technical training, he made up for in instinct. Instinct that was sharpened in solitude, where he could explore the emotions that others didn't see. His teen years were a blur of notebooks filled with lyrics, homemade, recordings, and quiet frustration, not because he wasn't getting attention, but because he hadn't yet found the right outlet to tell his story. Still, he studied business administration in college, walking a strange double life, student by day, songwriter by night, learning how the world works while dreaming of changing it with music. The irony was profound. He was equipping himself with tools to navigate a system that, as he would later learn, rarely respects vulnerability. But even then, long before the fame, the failure, and the rebirth, Chuck Adams was already laying the foundation for something rare. An identity rooted not in trends or TikTok, but in pain, love, and the raw honesty of a soul that couldn't be silenced. That truth, though invisible to the world at the time, was the one thing he'd never let go of, and it would become the anchor that saved him when everything else eventually collapsed. Chuck Adams's transition from a quiet college kid to a behind-the-scenes songwriting powerhouse wasn't fueled by luck. It was the result of emotional precision, creative obsession, and a relentless work ethic that blurred the line between dream and destiny. While pursuing a business degree by day, Chuck was constructing a secret life at night, one filled with melody, heartbreak, and late-night songwriting sessions in cramped dorm rooms. What began as personal therapy through lyrics soon turned into polished demos, and it didn't take long for his unique voice to catch the attention of people beyond his college campus. His understanding of business gave him an edge. He knew how to pitch, how to protect his work, and how to negotiate, without being swallowed whole. And that knowledge proved vital when the door opened to the mainstream music industry. Rebranding himself as Range, Chuck stepped into the professional realm, initially as a songwriter, co-writer, and vocal producer for some of the biggest names in R&B and hip-hop. One of his earliest breakout moments came in 2010 when he co-wrote One More Drink for Ludacris and T-Pain, a chart-friendly track that eventually earned him an ASCAP award. The industry began to whisper his name in hallways lined with platinum plaques, and those whispers turned into meetings. Meetings with agents, labels, and heavyweight producers who saw in him a fresh but seasoned creative. In a world where fame often comes with gimmicks and viral stunts, Chuck earned his recognition the old-fashioned way, by making hits that moved people. His trajectory seemed unstoppable, but even as the applause got louder and the rooms got bigger, a quiet dissonance began to grow inside him, one that would eventually cost him everything. But at that time, he had no reason to doubt the momentum. He had songs on the radio, industry buzz, and connections that could have catapulted him to household name status. Yet under all the surface-level success, the man who once sang Elvis songs to his mom in the living room was beginning to feel more like a product than a person, a conflict that would soon rip his career apart. When Chuck Adams transformed into Range, it wasn't just a new stage name. It was a brand, a persona, and a mask all rolled into one. Under that name, he became a hot commodity in the early 2010s, landing a major deal with Roc Nation thanks to a partnership with the elite production duo Stargate. With A-list connections, major label firepower, and a debut single titled Ghetto Dance featuring Rick Ross and a music video directed by Ray K, Range looked like the next big thing. Industry insiders were convinced he was about to blow up, and for a moment, so was he. Collaborations with Jaime Foxx, Tiny Tempa, Whale, and Ray J stacked up on his resume, each project further cementing his status as a rising star. But while the machine was working overtime to craft his image, Chuck felt himself slowly disappearing beneath it. The industry wanted hits, not honesty. It wanted formula, not feeling. The more successful Range became, the further Chuck drifted from his roots. He was shaping other people's sounds while silencing his own, crafting club anthems while burying the songs that poured from his soul in private. The stage lights got brighter, but his vision got blurrier. Fame wasn't freeing him, it was suffocating him. Behind the closed doors of studios and label meetings, he began to question if this version of himself was sustainable. Was he building a career or burying his truth? That internal tension grew until it could no longer be ignored. What started as quiet discomfort evolved into creative paralysis. He wasn't writing songs, he was fulfilling quotas. And with each new opportunity, he felt further from the boy who once wrote lyrics out of emotional necessity, not commercial obligation. What the world saw was an artist on the brink of stardom, but behind the curtain, Range was unraveling, and Chuck Adams was about to face the harshest wake-up call of his life. The moment when the machine that built him decided he was no longer useful. By 2011, the dream that Chuck Adams had spent a lifetime building came crashing down in a single phone call. Without warning, his promising record deal with Roc Nation was terminated, and the industry that once celebrated him moved on without a second glance. One minute, he was in sessions with Neo and Stargate, and the next, he was just another ghost in a system that devours talent at alarming speed. No final meeting, no gradual decline, just silence. And that silence hit harder than any rejection ever had. Chuck wasn't just dropped from a label, he was dropped from his own identity. For years, he had poured himself into a persona that no longer existed, and when it vanished, so did his sense of purpose. Emotionally devastated and creatively hollow, he walked away from the business entirely. The spotlight that once illuminated his rise now felt like a mocking glare. He disconnected from collaborators, stopped writing music, and retreated into a world where he didn't have to pretend. For nearly a decade, Chuck Adams vanished. Not because he lacked talent, but because he lacked the will to keep performing for a system that had discarded him like trash. The man who once shared studios with Grammy winners was now avoiding music altogether. He couldn't bring himself to sing. The heartbreak wasn't just professional, it was personal. Because for Chuck, music had always been tied to identity, to survival, to healing. And now, it felt like betrayal. Friends noticed his absence, but most in the industry didn't. In an ecosystem that prioritizes youth, virality, and constant content, Chuck's disappearance was barely a blip. But while the world forgot him, he began the painful process of remembering who he really was. Not range, not the next big thing, but Chuck Adams, a man with a voice worth fighting for. And though he didn't know it at the time, the silence that nearly destroyed him would eventually become the soil for his most authentic rebirth. In 2014, with no fanfare and no PR rollout, Chuck Adams quietly relocated to Nashville, a move that would become the unlikely catalyst for one of the most profound artistic rebirths in recent memory. There were no deals waiting, no industry contacts lined up, just a man and his suitcase full of grief, ambition, and unfinished songs. Nashville, with its storied songwriting culture and unpretentious roots, offered Chuck something he hadn't felt in years: freedom. No brand managers, no label agendas. Just the sound of his own thoughts and a guitar waiting to speak for him. In a small apartment far from Hollywood's glow, Chuck began to rebuild. He wrote obsessively, pouring his fears, failures, and hopes into songs that no one was supposed to hear, at least not yet. Tracks like 1,000 Tomorrows and Shotgun, released independently, became quiet testaments to his new direction. Raw, genre-defying, emotionally honest. Gone were the glossy club beats. In their place were acoustic strings, gospel, echoes, and the unmistakable imprint of soul. This wasn't rebranding. This was resurrection. Chuck was no longer trying to fit in. He was finally trying to be heard. And in that creative solitude, something miraculous happened. People started to notice, not the masses, not the charts, but a slow-growing circle of listeners who saw him not as a former industry casualty, but as a new kind of storyteller. Nashville hadn't changed him. It had uncovered him. His sound became a fusion of everything he had ever loved: country's vulnerability, gospel's conviction, R&B's texture, and hip-hop's truth. It wasn't just a sound, it was a statement that Chuck Adams was still here, still writing, still fighting. And while the industry may have walked away, his story was far from over. Throughout the years of triumph and collapse, one person remained Chuck Adams' unwavering lighthouse: his mother, Betty. From the very beginning, she was the first to hear his songs, the loudest voice in his cheering section, and the only person who never stopped believing in his talent, even when he stopped believing in it himself. For over a decade, Betty begged Chuck to audition for America's Got Talent, convinced that if the world could just hear his voice, the voice, she knew better than anyone, they would fall in love with it the way she always had. But Chuck wasn't ready. After being discarded by the industry, the thought of stepping onto a national stage again felt less like a dream and more like a nightmare. He feared the rejection, the exposure, the vulnerability. But Betty never wavered. She knew the world had changed, that audiences were now craving realness over perfection. And she knew that Chuck's story, his pain, his journey, his voice, was exactly what people needed to hear. She didn't pressure him. She encouraged him, gently, persistently, lovingly. And finally, when Chuck had spent enough time in the shadows, when his heart had healed just enough to risk breaking again, he listened. That decision, to trust his mother's belief over his own fear, would change everything. Because what Betty saw in Chuck wasn't a washed-up artist trying to make a comeback. She saw a man who had never been fully seen. And thanks to her, the world would soon see him too. When Chuck Adams finally stepped onto the America's Got Talent stage, he wasn't just another contestant chasing fame. He was a man confronting his past, his pain, and the possibility of being seen for who he truly was. With only a guitar in hand and no dramatic intro package, Chuck opened his soul to the world with a stripped-down acoustic rendition of Goo Goo Dolls' Iris. From the first haunting note, the room fell into a reverent silence. This wasn't just a performance. It was a reckoning. Every syllable carried the weight of a man who had lost everything and dared to hope again. The judges, normally quick to critique, were visibly moved. Simon Cowell, known for his cold precision, called Chuck's rendition transformative, praising his ability to make a well-known song feel like a confession. Howie Mandel saw a life lived through every lyric, noting that Chuck's voice held the textures of survival, heartbreak, and redemption. Mel B acknowledged his nerves, but declared his talent untapped and potentially limitless. Sofia Vergara simply called it beautiful and said he had the potential to go all the way. Then came the standing ovation, not just from the audience, but from every judge. 4 unanimous yes votes followed, and just like that, Chuck was no longer a forgotten voice. He was a contender, a sensation, a story that couldn't be ignored. But what truly made the moment historic wasn't the judges' praise. It was the eruption of emotion online. Viewers flooded comment sections, forums, and social media platforms, sharing how Chuck's song stirred something inside them that polished acts never could. They didn't just like him, they felt him. Many expressed outrage that he didn't receive the coveted golden buzzer, saying his performance outshined most who had. But in a way, the lack of golden confetti made it more powerful. Chuck wasn't propelled by gimmicks. He didn't need a viral stunt. He simply sang, and that was enough. In a show increasingly driven by spectacle, Chuck reminded America that the most unforgettable moments come from raw, unfiltered truth. And in doing so, he didn't just advance to the next round, he reignited a dream that had nearly died in silence. In the days following Chuck Adams's AGT audition, a movement began to form, not orchestrated by marketing teams or record labels, but by everyday people who saw themselves in his journey. Fans from all walks of life began sharing their own stories of lost dreams, missed chances, and second acts they had never dared to pursue until they saw Chuck. Social media threads turned into digital support groups, comment sections into collective cries of admiration and gratitude. Many confessed they hadn't watched AGT in years, but were drawn back by the authenticity of one man and one performance. Chuck had become more than a contestant. He was a symbol, a reminder that life doesn't follow a straight line, and that it's never too late to rise again. Support poured in from viewers who had battled illness, grief, addiction, or simply the crushing weight of being overlooked, all saying that Chuck gave them permission to hope again. His face began appearing in fan art, tribute videos, and reaction channels, each echoing the same sentiment: this man is different. And he was. Chuck wasn't trying to impress, he was trying to connect. And that connection exploded into something the AGT producers hadn't predicted. Viewers flooded the network with messages asking why he didn't receive a golden buzzer, arguing that no other performance had generated such an emotional response. Hashtags like "Chuck deserved." The buzzer began trending. But Chuck didn't complain. He didn't chase validation. He simply thanked his new supporters and promised to keep giving them the real version of himself. His rise wasn't fueled by hype. It was fueled by healing. And in a landscape where artists are often molded by algorithms, Chuck stood out because he was molded by life. He wasn't the producer's darling. He was the people's finalist. And in a season filled with spectacle, he was the one they remembered. Because long after the lights dim and the show ends, what people carry with them isn't just the performance, it's the story. And Chuck Adams had a story that made people believe in their own. With his AGT moment behind him and the national spotlight finally fixed on his journey, Chuck Adams stands at a crossroads, not of career decisions, but of purpose. For most, a viral audition would mark a comeback. For Chuck, it's a beginning, because everything he's done since returning to music, every self-recorded track, every lyric written in solitude, every quiet prayer whispered in the dark, has been about more than reclaiming a platform. It's been about reclaiming himself. His 2024 single, A Place Called Heaven, written and recorded alone in his Nashville apartment, is a testament to that evolution. It's not a polished industry product. It's a cry for connection, an offering to anyone who's ever felt lost, forgotten, or unworthy. It's the kind of song that doesn't aim for the charts. It aims for the heart. And that's who Chuck has become. Not an entertainer, but a vessel. A voice for those silenced by fear, trauma, or time. Nashville didn't just change his sound. It gave him space to discover it. By blending country's storytelling with gospel's spirit, R&B's soul, and hip-hop's honesty, he's forged a style that defies boxes and invites listeners to feel instead of judge. He's no longer chasing approval from executives or metrics. He's chasing truth. And in doing so, he's built a platform far more powerful than a major label deal. One built on community, authenticity, and emotional resonance. Fans don't see him as a brand. They see him as a mirror, reflecting their own brokenness and resilience back at them through every note. Chuck Adams isn't here to make it in the traditional sense. He's here to matter. And in a world drowning in noise, he's become a rare signal of clarity, reminding us all that the most powerful comeback isn't the one that breaks the internet. It's the one that heals the soul. For Chuck, the journey from silence to stage wasn't about redemption. It was about revelation. And now that his voice has found its way back, there's no turning down the volume.